Thanks, Duncan, and good evening, everybody. Thanks ever so much for coming along. Let me start by saying the so-called labour unrest, or what I think and argue more accurately should be described as the labour revolt, that swept Britain in the years leading up to the First World War, 1910 to 1914. Really, I think everyone, you would agree with one of the most sustained, dramatic and certainly violent explosions of industrial militancy and social confrontation that this country's ever seen. After a relative strike quiescence lasting about 20 years, there was a sudden and unanticipated eruption that really dwarfed that of the new unionist strike wave that had occurred in the late 1880s. And rather ironically, by the time that Robert Tressel's celebrated classic novel, The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropist, had been published in 1914, 3 years after the death of its author, its depiction of exploited but also fairly apathetic workers in the face of basic socialist arguments, I think, had been superseded by the actuality of an explosion of working class self-activity, in which really the working class came to the very centre stage. Now, you'll be familiar, no doubt, the fact that the strike wave involved a number of very large national strikes in strategically important areas of the economy: seamen, dockers, transport workers, railway workers, engineering workers, and so on and so forth. There was about 4,600 strikes during this period. And we're talking about strikes which were predominantly, but not exclusively, that of unskilled and semi-skilled workers. They encompassed, of course, many workers who were members of trade unions, but many workers who were not. And what we saw was strikers enjoy considerable success. There was a fairly dramatic shift in the balance of power away from workers during this 4 to 5 year period, an absolutely enormous increase in the level of trade union membership, the beginnings of the complete transformation of trade union organisation in Britain, and also a political radicalisation within which the radical left, I think, was to play an important role. Now, before I sort of, look at some of the key features of this revolt, which I explore in the book, I mean, let me just say something about the approach. I mean, obviously, there's, a considerable body of existing literature, albeit ironically, I think, given the, if you compare the general strike of 1926, the miners' strike of 84-85, on which, for which, as you will know, there is more than 50 books, and both cases, actually, and yet both were workers' defeats. When we think of workers' victories, like 1972 or 1910 to 1914, the period in which generally workers were successful, it's fairly remarkable how little there has been in terms of single comprehensive texts. There have been individual texts like George Dangerfield's journalistic study, Bob Holton's study on British syndicalism, in which the strikes figure, and of course a whole number of very respected labour historians, as part of a broader study of different features of labour history, have integrated the labour unrest or labour revolt within that to one degree or another. But what I've took the view is that much of this, although extremely useful, and I've certainly built on this, also was very partial, fairly fragmentary, and sometimes either ignored or downplayed at least significant features of the revolt in terms of the relationship between broader economic industrial factors and the role of agency, the degree to which strikes were just a spontaneous eruption, or the role of activists, in particular the radical left. The dynamic of the relationship between workers and their trade union officials and so on, the degree of political generalisation. These are some of the issues which I wanted to explore. And in terms of the evidence, what I did was try to build on existing literature by looking at some primary evidence in terms of Home Office and Cabinet papers, Board of Trade reports on strikes and lockouts, House of Commons debates, police reports, trade union TUC and trade union conference reports, national and provincial newspapers, the left-wing press, and also a whole number of personal reflections from individual participants at the time. That having been said, let me draw, what was obviously one of the key features of this revolt, and that was its predominantly unofficial character, in which rank and file strikers often clashed with their national trade union leaders, and therefore action often took place independently of those national officials who were seen as being unresponsive to workers' grievances and whose advocacy of moderation and compromise was often rejected by workers in favour of militant organisation and action from below. And indeed, what most disturbed employers during this period was the failure of such national union officials. Their failure to often channel workers' grievances through the established mechanisms of collective bargaining and conciliation machinery. According to J.T. Murphy, of course, the syndicalist activist based in Sheffield, he says, and I quote, "To be again the officials was as much a part of the nature of the syndicalist-minded workers of that time as to be again the government was part of the nature of an Irishman." And, one obvious example of this was the way in which it was unofficial strike action by railmen in Liverpool that spread to a number of other railway centres around the country, which forced the hand of the main railway workers union leaders to call an official national strike, which eventually was to embrace 200,000 workers. And there was a similar unofficial dynamic to a whole number of the important strikes which took place during the period, which I explore. It led the government's leading industrial relations advisor, a sort of troubleshooter who spent all his time going from one strike to another, trying to settle the strike, the ubiquitous George Asquith. He wrote a series of cabinet papers for the cabinet on the strife during the period, which I looked at, and his argument was that to warn that the older generation of conciliatory national trade union leaders could no longer maintain their authority. And he said, and I quote, "Often there was more difference between the men and their leaders than between the latter and the employers." And here I think an important factor in the development of this independent working class power was the role which was assumed by young workers, both male and female, who eagerly sought new forms of militant organisation that would allow for a direct struggle against the employers and the government, and thereby transcend the defensive mentality which had become embedded inside the trade union movement during the preceding period. And therefore, direct action, the idea that workers shouldn't look to somebody else to solve their grievances, but really had to take action themselves in the workplace through strike activity, this really became the gospel of the day. And it's reflected in the way in which I think much of the strike activity, you see a sort of belligerent working class self-confidence, vigorous, almost emancipatory nature of the strike activity, in which although strikes were focused on the immediate issues of wages and conditions, and particularly in those areas where there was no union organisation, on the right of trade union recognition and collective organisation and so on, they obviously reflected much broader concerns, underlying concerns with dignity, with self-respect, with control over working lives. This was a feature of what was termed the sort of effervescence of youth of the period. And I think it was captured beautifully by the Irish Transport and General Workers leader, Jim Larkin, when he observed, and I quote, "Labour has lost its old humility and its respectful finger touching its cap." Crucially, the realization that it was militant strike action that could win important concessions from employers and government, I think had a demonstration effect that encouraged strikes as a key weapon across many, many different industries. And it led to what I term in the book a sort of virtuous circle between strike mobilisation, leading to tangible material gains in pay and conditions and collective organisation, leading to a huge growth in the development of trade union membership, and leading to the revitalisation of trade union organisation. And, just to underlie this, I mean, previously, unorganised workers literally flocked into the unions en masse, so that during the 4.5-5 year period, membership grew by no less than 62%. Now, sorry, I should have moved my slides along there. Secondly, I want to just flag up the way in which it seems to me many of the strikes developed with what I would call a sort of rank and file trade union official dynamic or interplay, which was very, very important, and in which union officials played a significant role, albeit in many cases, at least, not always, in a restraining fashion in terms of grassroots potential. And what I draw out in the book is the way in which, on the one hand, many national union leaders were emphatically opposed to strike action by members in their own unions, and did often what they could to try to stymie this, not always with success. And so, you know, here I'm talking about Jimmy Thomas of the Railmen, James Sexton of the Dockers, and so on, who viewed strikes as being undesirable because, of course, they saw them as undermining their attempt to forge stable, more cooperative sets of relations with employers and government in order to try to strike collective agreements and so on. On the other hand, what you see is that the sheer impetus from below, the sort of insurgency of workers angry at the declining purchasing power, the intensification of work and so on and so forth, pushing for action, often had the effect in turn of then forcing these more moderate or more conservative union leaders into having to support strikes, and sometimes even call national official strikes themselves. And of course, this was very important because it then extended and broadened the extent of mobilization than would otherwise have been the case. However, many of these officials did so in terms of then trying to, I mean, you know, they felt under pressure because if they weren't seen to be supporting the strikes, then any sort of credibility or confidence in their leadership was being undermined. On the other hand, once they then began to support the strikes, often what happened is they begin to try to reassert their control with the view to restraining strike activity, with trying to find ways and means of restricting the degree of militancy of workers, of striking compromise deals that fell far short of the original demands and workers' expectations, of sometimes trying to foist deals over the heads of workers and so on and so forth. This was certainly a tendency which, you know, I look at in a number of the different disputes. Now, this wasn't always the case, of course. There were some national officials, for example, Ben Tillett of the Dockers. If you think of Tom Mann, who himself straddled the rank and file and official divide. And of course, he was a militant, he was a syndicalist, he was the chairman of the Liverpool 1911 Strike Committee, but he was also an official employed by the Seamen's Union and the Transport Workers Federation and so on. These characters obviously played an extremely important and positive role in attempting to mobilise and extend the action that took place. And there were other national officials, often in some of the smaller unions, as well as I think a layer of, you know, regional or local officials who probably in today's language would regard more as trade union organisers, who I think also, because generally they were closer to the grassroots, tended to be more sympathetic to their demands and therefore more supportive of strikes. But this tendency of restraint by officials, I think, was to be exemplified by the way in which the so-called Triple Alliance played itself out. Here, pressure by rank and file workers of the three main unions of miners, of the railmen, and the transport workers over a number of years put the pressure on the national leaders of these unions to agree to a triple alliance. So this opened up the potential for the coordination of coordinated strike activity, embracing about 1.5 million workers, and thereby opened up a much wider combat, field of combat. In fact, as we know, for many of these national officials involved, it was not seen as a means of promoting coordinated strike action, still less a weapon, a revolutionary weapon to overthrow capitalism in the way in which the syndicalists were advocating, but merely a means of equipping themselves with greater bargaining leverage in order to try to encourage employers and government to make concessions without the need for any strike activity. So this was, and I think, an important feature of the period in which union officials generally, not always, but generally and in varying ways, acted as a brake on membership militancy. Now, another very important, I think, quite novel characteristic was the willingness of significant sections of workers during this period to take action in support of others. and I'm talking about here workers who were not involved in disputes themselves as such, but when faced with strikes by other workers, were prepared, and for example, to refuse to touch so-called tainted goods. In other words, in the case of a sort of dockers strike, where scabs had walked across a picket line and were operating movement of goods and so on, railwomen refusing to touch this in solidarity. But in addition, what we find again and again throughout this pre-war period are groups of workers not in dispute going on strike in support of other groups of workers, and then sometimes putting in their own demands on their own employers. And this obviously contributes enormously to the resilience of the strikers' movement. William Mellor, who was the secretary of the Manchester and Salford Trades and Labour Council, as it was known at the time, says, and I quote, "For the first time in England, the sympathetic strike was evoked on a large scale and effectively used as a weapon of industrial warfare." And really what I argue in the book is it was the fundamental strategic innovation of this period. And you see this, I think, really, in graphic relief during the transport strikes that swept the country, when there were separate but simultaneous strikes taking place. And in Manchester, the ubiquitous George Asquith was forced to rush up from London, ensconced himself in the Manchester Town Hall, and spent 5 days and 5 nights negotiating with 18 different groups of transport workers that were on strike at the time, or in different rooms of the town hall, trying to get agreements to settle the disputes. But all of the different groups of workers pledged themselves not to return to work until all of them had received agreements which they were satisfied with. In other words, solidarity, which was broadening day-to-day struggles against individual employers into a struggle against employers in general. Other expressions of this extent of solidarity, I think, were to be found in the absolutely incredible degree of solidarity for the 1913 Dublin lockout. Really, the only comparable degree of event, I think, phenomena was probably around the 1984-5 miners' strike. And it expressed itself in a number of ways. Partly there was the absolutely enormous sums of money, into the millions and millions of pounds in today's money, and also the chartered food ships stuffed with margarine and butter and jam and so on, in order to materially sustain the 20,000 locked out workers and their families through the 6-month lockout. But in addition, there was the incredibly large attendances at the rallies that were held across the country that James Larkin addressed, appealing for support. In Manchester, for example, the Free Trade Hall stuffed to the rafters, 20,000 people outside, unable to get in. And in addition, there were 2 bouts of unofficial strike action by railwomen in support of the Dublin lockout, the effect of that lockout in different parts of the country. And the combination of these factors, I think, led the TUC, who had already had its annual congress, in an unprecedented fashion to call a special one-day conference to discuss organising support for the Dublin dispute. I mean, as it happened, the TUC were to stick the knife into the back of Jim Larkin, but that, that's another story. Another graphic display of the solidarity, I think, was the 1911 Liverpool General Transport strike. 66,000 workers, remarkable degree of occupational unity between different trades, different sort of unions, different forms of occupation and so on, and also the partial, at least, suspension of religious hostility between Catholic and Protestant workers in a city, of course, which was marked by its sectarian divide. And more broadly, I think you see the way in which activists in a whole number of different unions were building support to try to overcome the inherent fragmentation and sectionalism of the existing structures of trade unionism, predominantly sort of craft forms, in favour of more industrial forms, industrial types of unionism through amalgamation and fusion and so on. And of course, the most notable example of this was the way in which the leaders of the 3 main railway workers' unions felt under pressure to agree to a merger to lead to a single industrial union, the National Union of Railway, of course, the forerunner of today's RNC. Now, although they only formed, the number of women workers on strike was only a fraction of its their male counterparts, the fact is women workers did play an extremely important role and were active in a whole number of different strikes around the country, with young women, young girls in particular, often the driving force. And I spent quite a bit of time looking for this and trying to, in the book, provide lots of examples of this. And here I'm talking about strikes, not only by women in, if you like, so-called women-only workplaces, but in workplaces where they're a distinct minority. And not only in workplaces where they were unionised, such as textile workers in Lancashire, say, but also in many workplaces, manufacturing in factories where women had no form of prior collective organisation. And here, of course, the role of the National Federation of Women Workers, the all-female trade union organisation led by Mary McCarthy, clearly plays a very significant role. And what seems to me in looking at this is that integral to the relative success of the National Federation in spectacularly growing its union membership was the way that it had developed a sort of evangelical style of trade unionism that made determined efforts to utilise strike action as the means to build the union and to recruit workers to the organisation. And indeed, when you look at the union's record during this period, it's essentially one of going from one strike to another. Jute workers in Dundee, the chain makers in Cradleheath in the Midlands, the 15,000 women in 20 different factories in Bermondsey in southeast London. And particularly in the unorganised area, the strikes tended to follow a sort of pattern whereby workers would walk out on one, in some respects spontaneously, in other cases being egged on by the Federation and other activists from the outside. They call on the Federation, or in some cases the Workers' Union, leading organiser Julia Varley, who come down to the strikes, recruit workers en masse to the trade union, help them form a strike committee, help them force out of the employers important concessions over pay and conditions, and also the right of union organisation. And overall, I think it's the participation of women in such strike activity during this period which clearly leads to an extension of union organisation among women by no less than 54%. And it really creates a credible base for the permanent sort of entry of women into the trade union movement in a much broader scale than had ever occurred before. Now, beyond this, I also looked at the way in which many women strikers appear to have been influenced and emboldened, not only by the growing industrial militancy in which their male counterparts were involved, but also by the simultaneous militant women's suffrage movement of the day, which of course was fighting the Liberal government to demanding the right for women to have the vote. And here, it seems to me the role of the suffragettes, I'm not ignoring the suffragists, which are looked at in the book and so on, but the suffragettes with their advocacy of militant civil disobedience, of deeds, not words, which led, as we know, to, literally physical attacks on Liberal government ministers, the blowing up of letterboxes, arson attempts at buildings across the country, the slashing of artwork in galleries and so on and so forth. As a consequence, I think what we see during this period is the overall weakening of traditional respect for so-called law and order and constitutional behaviour, which characterises the militancy of the suffrage movement, particularly the suffragette movement, but also I think of the worker struggles of the period. You see this reflected in the way in which I think many women worker strikes are very assertive, very aggressive, if not very violent. Women utilising mass picketing to extend the strike to other groups of workers. I utilise some examples in South Wales, for example, where women use mass picketing to go into a brewery and literally throw casks of beer into the dock in terms of pulling other women out on strike. In a sweets factory where women complained that they're literally dragged out on strike. And literally, equally, you see again and again women using being involved in physical attacks on blacklegs, people who'd scabbed on the strike, in the Wilson Bobbin strike in Garston in Liverpool in 1913, real sort of confrontations on the streets as women attempt to assert their collective right to try to extend the dispute and so on. And it leads, I provide the story of how in 1913 in the Bliss Tweed Mill strike in Chipping Norton, in Oxfordshire, one of the women strikers, a woman called Annie Cooper, was found guilty and sentenced to 14 days in prison for assaulting a strike breaker. But when she was released, She was met by a jubilant crowd of 1,000 supporters. She was paraded in a wagon pulled by the strikers, headed by a brass band, and taken to a packed meeting at the town hall. And another feature here, I think, was the way in which, during the course of many of the strikes that essentially involve male workers, here I'm thinking about, the miners, dockers, the railmen, etc. There clearly develops a culture of community solidarity, of aggression and self-defense that sees the wives, the girlfriends, the sisters of many of the male strikers participating in their hundreds again and again and again up and down the country. And I don't just mean participating in terms of local solidarity demonstrations or generating financial support or the collection and distribution of food, all of which was being done, but also, again, involved in helping strikers in terms of picketing on blacklegs, involved in confrontations on the streets with the police and the military and so on. In Manchester, during the transport strikes, when 3,000 strikers had blockaded the Shude Hill wholesale market in the centre of town, there were literally dozens of women who were assisting the strikers, picking up peas and strawberries from the market and throwing them at the police. And then 2,000 of them marching from Salford into Manchester, holding their babies often in their arms, with their shawls over their head, with banners proclaiming their support for the strikers. And this was a feature, again, as I say, to be found in many different strikes, not merely national, but also local strikes and so on. And I think occasionally the link between the labour and the suffrage revolts, you see this fairly, relatively explicitly. And so, for example, at the 1912 Gundy's Net and Rope factory in Bridport in Dorset, women strikers marched through the town singing the suffragette anthem, shoulder to shoulder. Likewise in Southwark Park, at a huge rally in support of the Bermondsey women's strike, when one of the platform speakers gets up, Charlotte Despard, a well-known suffrage activist, but also had been involved in supporting the strike, there's rapturous cries of good old suffragette. And of course, it's from within the suffragette movement that there's at least a small minority of critical voices who argue for the need to extend the fight for women's right to the vote to take up broader general social economic issues as well. And undoubtedly the most important contribution in this respect, as you will know, was Sylvia Pankhurst with the East London Federations organisation, which was very much involved in taking up broader social and housing issues and so on, but also in supporting a whole series of women's strikes that took place during this period. And of course, what Sylvia Pankhurst does in a sense is challenge not only those in the suffragette leadership, namely her mother and her sister, to argue that social questions, class, workers' industrial struggles have to be part of the struggle for women's suffrage, but she also challenges those in the Labour and the Socialist movement who were very dismissive of women's suffrage, of taking up issues to do with women's oppression, and so on and so forth. Now, the book also explores the way in which strikers' antagonists counter-mobilised. And I've got to give a shortened version here. There's much more nuance and variation in the book and so on. But essentially, I think, first of all, employers again and again adopted a very obdurate stance towards strike demands. They refused to compromise. They even attempted to starve workers into submission by forcing very long strikes. And I'm talking strikes that lasted for many, many weeks. Indeed, many employers locked out workers, involving over 100,000 workers on occasion. Many employers encouraged their workforce to defy the strike by crossing a picket line. And in fact, they would encourage other workers from anywhere across the country to come and scab on the strike, and then demanded police protection for them. And likewise, the government, often confronted with national strikes in key industries, fearing its loss of control of the challenge which was being mounted, although it adopted a few conciliatory sort of measures of trying to encourage conciliation machinery and sort of cooperative relationship with some national officials, essentially also adopted a very, very hard line in stance indeed. Winston Churchill, of course, was the Home Secretary during the period. And what you see is the government authorised the deployment of enormous detachments of police officers to buttress the local police forces in any strike-bound area. So there could be a strike in Manchester, and police forces in Liverpool, say, and there could be police forces from Manchester, from Sheffield, from Birmingham. I mean, the Metropolitan Police during this period effectively operated as a sort of mobile strike-breaking army, going from one dispute to another on so many occasions. Likewise, the government authorised on quite a number of occasions troops to be sent in, armed with their bayonets, with guns aloft. And of course, the role of the police and the military was to provide a physical escort to attempt to allow them to get into work, to counteract the strikers picketing in an attempt to pull the rug from underneath the dispute and so on. And it's this very provocative behaviour which inevitably leads to repeated outbursts of dramatic violent confrontation and on occasion rioting in the streets. And this leads to literally hundreds of arrests and prosecutions, to numerous casualties, and on occasion fatalities. And just to give you, some of the examples of this, which you may or may not be already familiar, in the 1910 South Wales miners' dispute, when mass picketing by miners is thwarted by huge ranks of police drawn from, right across the area. There's rioting in the town of Tonypandy, which leads to one striker being bludgeoned to death over the head by a police baton. During the National Seamen's and Dockers strikes, when again police and military are dispatched to all the major waterfronts across the country in an attempt to undermine the picketing that's involved, there's repeated violent confrontations. And these take place, for example, in Liverpool, in London, in Hull, in Salford and Manchester, in Glasgow, in Bristol, in Cardiff, and so on. And in the Liverpool General Transport strike, again, hundreds of police, thousands of troops are dispatched into the city, imposing a form of sort of martial law. When a Royal Navy gunboat is positioned on the River Mersey with its guns trained on the city, when 80,000 workers demonstrate outside St George's Square, mounted police launch an assault, battening it through the demonstration, hospitalising 350. This leads to rioting over the next 48-hour period, in which 2 workers, a carter and a docker, are shot dead by troops. And then in the National Railway strike, no less than 50,000 troops were mobilised and were dispatched to all the major strategic rail centres across the country. In the South Wales town of Llanelli, when strikers attempt to stop the scab movement of a train on the tracks, another 2 workers are shot dead by the military. Okay, well, next, seems to me, I tried to draw out, there's a whole chapter on this, the way in which the Labour Revolt contributes to a widespread questioning of, and in some respects at least, a direct challenge to the existing political system in Edwardian Britain. Now, on this, I don't really buy the argument of, the journalist George Dangerfield in his otherwise, beautiful book, The Strange Death of Liberal England, which I certainly recommend people to read if they've not done so already. But which I think presents an over-exaggerated picture of what he seems to, depict as almost a semi-revolutionary situation. On the other hand, I don't buy either the argument of those industrial relations or more orthodox Labour history authors. Here I'm thinking of Hugh Clegg and I can't remember somebody else, I can't remember who's come to me now, who sort of argue that, yes, there's lots of strike activity and so on, but essentially it was violence, but essentially it was confined within a form of trade union consciousness. What I've tried to do in the book is draw out the way in which it seems to me that in pursuing their struggles over immediate wages and conditions and the rights of collective organisation, clearly, as I've indicated before, workers had a whole series of underlying fundamental concerns that had been built up and dammed up over the period, and which have of a much broader generalised kind. And at the same time, when faced with such intransigence from employers, with hesitant, if not oppositional, national union leaders, with the hostility of government officials, with the violence of police and the military, again and again in many, many different disputes, both national and local, it seems to me that what you see is a sharp polarization, a sharp social and political polarization between workers on the one hand and employers, the government and the state on the other. And meanwhile, I think one's got to bear in mind that many of the workers who are taking strike action are seeming to be disaffected with parliamentary politics. And I don't just mean the functioning of the two bourgeois parties, the Liberals and the Tories, but also by the functioning of the newly formed Labour Party in the House of Commons, that basically operates as a mere adjunct to the Liberal government of the day. And therefore, with its preoccupation with the idea of gradualist reform from above and its electoral considerations, I think what we see is that the Labour Party at its best is fairly irrelevant to the Labour revolt, and at its worst is openly antagonistic to militant strike activity. And as a result, therefore, the established, if you like, rules of the game, that is piecemeal social reform, by means either of institutionalized collective bargaining through the channel of trade unions negotiated by officials on the one hand, or by change from above through parliamentary means through the channel of the Labour Party and MPs in the House of Commons on the other, are put under considerable strain. And in its place, what is reinforced, I think, is the appeal of combative industrial struggle as the weapon to advance labour movement interests. And here, therefore, I think it does encourage a process of radicalisation, a counter-politics, which stands for the celebration of class solidarity and militant action in an attempt to defeat the employers and the government and so on. Moreover, as I've already intimated, this workers' rebellion, this workers' revolt takes place within the broader context of an escalating militant civil disobedience, deeds not words, suffrage revolt. And it also takes place against the backcloth of the battle for Irish independence against British imperialism, in which there's a reactionary counter-mobilisation in Ulster, but also by important elements of the British ruling class in reaction to the attempt to introduce a Home Rule Bill. And therefore, both of these, I think, help to feed a wider challenge to the political system in Edwardian Britain taking place at the period in terms of reinforcing extra parliamentary sort of notions. And therefore, I think within the revolt, there are at least elements that are capable of developing into a coherent challenge to the existing system of society, even though that may not have happened. But what we do see, and I think one of the most remarkable features, is the way in which in a whole number of the transport strikes, I mean, it's I think fairly well known about in Liverpool, but not so well known in many other places, in Cardiff, in Hull, in Manchester, in Dundee, and London, and so on. Strike committees established systems of permits which obliged employers to have to seek permission in order to be able to move goods around the city. This was invariably turned down by the strikers unless it was bread and milk or whatever for a hospital. And thereby what you see are strikers taking over vital elements of power and authority from employers, the civic authorities of the government, and acting as potential, at least, embryonic alternative organs of working class power. And so in this respect, I think what the Labour revolt represents is a reaction to and possibly a rejection of, in some respect, the politics of gradualism in favour of mass struggle from below. A determination to shift the balance of class forces through extra parliamentary struggle. And in the process, it offers at least the prospect of a different type of world, a different type of society. Now, another area to look at is the role of the left, because it seems to me that, there's actually a chapter on the stimulus and context of the strike, which I'm not able to look at in any detail, but obviously the strikes are provoked and stimulated by material economic factors and so on, and also by the political context, which I've mentioned, but also by a whole series of other factors, institutionalized constraints and so on, which, as I say, I'll look at in a separate chapter. But it seems to me that action often, at least critically, depended also on the encouragement that workers received from thousands of workplace union activists and militants within their own ranks, in identifying and articulating and stimulating workers' growing awareness of their grievances, in advocating militant forms of struggle as being legitimate and effective means to seek redress, assuming leadership roles, generating solidarity action, generalising from worker-specific economic grievances to broader class-wide and more political concerns. And here I think, you know, despite the fact that they only formed a small minority of the labour movement, I think the ideological and organisational influence of radical left activists and groups during a period of time when the Labour Party was a relative marginal force, it seems to me was of significance and importance in a number of ways. And here I'm not just talking about the Jim Larkins or the Tom Manns of the world. I'm talking about a whole layer of union activists, for example, in many different industries and unions involved in the amalgamation committees. I'm talking about the left wing of the Independent Labour Party. I'm talking about members of one of the two Marxist organisations of the day, the Social Democratic Federation, which became the British Socialist Party, the Socialist Labour Party. I'm talking about people involved with the Tom Mann's Industrial Syndicalist Education League, talking about activists involved around the Plebs League and the fight for independent working class education. And of course, the many, many thousands of people who were readers of one of the two main circulation newspapers, the Clarion and the Daily Herald at the time. Probably about 50,000 socialists of one sort or another, who many of them were involved in supporting the strikes in varying ways, in a number of occasions actually being in the leadership of strikes. And it seems to me what this left does is provide an intensely ideological and political cutting edge to workers' militancy. Probably, you know, most notably, with their emphasis on anti-parliamentary direct action that bypasses the orthodox bargaining machinery and sort of parliamentary mechanisms, the syndicalists with their advocacy of revolutionary change from below and so on. It seems to me that this is a message which clearly falls on fertile ground. I'm not trying to exaggerate this. It's strict minority in terms of the mass of workers as a whole, but it certainly seems to fall on fertile ground during the period. Okay, well, finally, I want to say something, of course, about the what happened, because this forward momentum of a working class revolt, let alone any revolutionary outcome, of course, was to be seriously undermined by numerous underlying limitations and weaknesses. And I look at these within the book, but in rather more detail than I'm able to flag up now. But let me just raise some of the issues which are explored. I mean, clearly there are some very serious setbacks and reverses during this period. It's not all one of victories by any means. For example, there's the terrible defeat of the London transport strike of 1912. There's the absolutely disastrous defeat of the Dublin lockout of 1913. There's the way that, as I've indicated, although the momentum of the revolt came very much from below through rank and file activity, the fact is that national trade union officials were often able ultimately, and in varying ways and so on, to assert their control over disputes and their conduct and their ending. And this, on a whole number of occasions, was to have deleterious consequences. Related to this, I think, was the relative weakness of rank and file organisation, because although there was much enthusiasm amongst on the shop floor and the grassroots of unions and so on, the extent to which there were cross-union, cross-industry, local and national networks of resistance and so on that could put not only pressure on trade union officials, but also be prepared to support workers to act unofficially of them and to overcome the role of officials. This was really in only embryonic stage. And of course, it was to take the First World War shop stewards movement and then the events of 1919, 1920 before you see this develop in any real more advanced form. There's the continued gender divisions. And so, yes, it's true that women workers, for example, in the Midlands metal worker strikes, win significant increases in pay and conditions and so on. But the fact is women still paid considerably less than men. This is in a society marked by its sexual division of labour. This is not really altered. And moreover, notwithstanding the much celebrated single industrial union, the National Union of Railmen, as its name actually suggested, this was an organisation which actually excluded women, despite the fact there were about 15,000 women working in the industry at the time. There's the way that the Liberal government was able to accommodate the simultaneous three revolts. the Workers' Revolt, the Suffrage Revolt, and the Irish Revolt. And although, there are some interconnections between these, and again, I explore these, particularly in terms of the Labour Revolt and the Suffrage Revolt, there's also what remains as a huge and frustrating gulf between them. These movements effectively exist side by side on parallel tracks, and this undermines their potential united power that might have been. And then, of course, there's the political and strategic limitations of the radical left. And again, I explore this in some detail, but I think the most notable thing is the sharp separation that's made between the industrial struggle, the economic struggle of workers on the one hand, and political activity, political organisation and action on the other. And again, although there are activists who, some individuals who try to fuse these together and transcend the separation, by and large this doesn't take place. And so the syndicalists, for example, put all the emphasis on the industrial struggle, to the subordination of political organisation and action. The British Socialist Party puts much of its emphasis on political activity and only reluctantly, in a sense, sees a role for trade union action. And again, it's to take the struggles of the First World War and then the immediate aftermath for there to be a sort of radical reassessment of the strategy and tactics of the radical left before some of these issues are really overcome and resolved in a different fashion. And then finally, of course, the strike wave anyway was to shudder to a halt. It stopped in its tracks by the onset of the First World War in August of 1914. And although there was a collapse of, and again, I sort of look in a final denouement chapter, there is the literal collapse of strike activity. And this isn't to say that that doesn't resume with some force as the war progresses, and then it, of course, explode into a new revolt immediately after. My final point is merely to draw, just to say something about the contemporary relevance, because although like I'm sure many of you good selves were interested in labour history and intrinsically in its own right, we're also interested into what might be of relevance to today's world and what might carry over. Now, I don't want to get over exaggerated here. There's lots of considerable differences, fundamental differences between then and now, but it seems to me there are some common themes. The problem of trade union officialdom, the problem of rank and file networks and rank and file organisation that can put pressure but also act independently. When one thinks of the strike wave over the last year as significant, as important as it's been compared with the 30 years preceding it, these are issues which I think come clearly to mind. There's the importance of solidarity action, which seems to me to be crucial in terms of both sustaining workers materially, but also extending the field of battle. There's the direct reciprocal relationship between, which I mentioned earlier on, between strike activity leading to the building of union membership and vitality of organisation. There's the power of extra parliamentary direct action from below through the workplace and through demonstrations on the streets and so on, as opposed to looking above to change from above in a sort of gradualist fashion. There's the potential important role that the radical left can play, at least as catalysts within worker struggles, and there's the crucial relationship between economic struggle and politics, and that's the one which has always been of significance then, as is the case now. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Ralph.